Well, I'm speaking today. A couple Sundays ago, I heard him on the military channel, and I thought, boy, this would be a great speaker for us. And we're lucky to have him today, Dick Carroll. He was at B-24s in the 15th Air Force, and he's got a great story. Got it? Okay.
Thank you. Good afternoon. Right, real close. Is that better? Everybody here now? Very good. Everybody has a beginning, I guess. I'll start with being born. And I was born on a dairy farm southeast of Rosemount, Minnesota. And it wasn't long after I was born that I had to be introduced to being a farm boy. So I grew up with purebred Holsteins and a dozen horses that we used for power because gasoline at that time was rather expensive, like 12 to 16 cents a gallon, and it was much cheaper to feed our horses oats and hay that we raised on the farm. So we always had a dozen horses because we had that much work to do on our 280 acres of land. So my dad gave me a bundling job, thrashing. I had my own team of horses and wagon to go out and load up and bring in the bundles to be thrashed and work from there. At age 13, most kids that age don't really have a whole lot to do other than to deliver papers or something like that. But on the farm, there's always work to be done. In fact, with our purebred Holsteins, we milked for about 10 years in the 30s and early 40s, 3 times a day rather than just twice a day. So that gives you an idea of our work schedule on the farm. In the winter, we didn't have time off because we had to be planning grain to sell to other farmers. So we always kept up to date with the University of Minnesota with new strains of oats, barley, and wheat and corn, so that we could sell the grain. And of course, we did the germination test with the University of Minnesota, so that we had official proof that everything was kosher, you know. So that was my growing up period of life. I wanted originally to be a cowboy. I loved horses. I liked to ride. We never had a saddle. We always rode bareback. My oldest brother took my next older son, or rather brother, to see a movie when I was 6 years old. That was my first movie. It was a silent movie at that time. And then part of it was circus review. And there were acrobats that, you know, would jump up on a horse going around in a circle, and they would stand up on the horse as it rode around. So I thought that was a neat idea. So as I chased the cows out towards the pasture, they had a tendency to lay down in the cow yard and get dirty. So we generally moved them out into the pasture so they could eat some grass and then rest on grass rather than in the backyard of the cow barn. And so coming back from getting the cows out to the pasture, I'd be riding on Mexi, our light team of horses, as two of them were brother and sisters. I stand up on Mexi and I get her into a nice slow gallop, you know, so you have a nice bouncing along and a rhythm. And I forgot that my mother had to lock up her brooder house in the evening just before dark, and she caught me riding, standing up on this horse on a nice.
How did you get out of the farm and get into the war?
Get into the war? Okay, well, I'm just trying to tell you how my love for horses, you know, and when she spotted me, she threw her arms up in the air and was just amazed. And of course, I slowed Mexi down and jumped off the horse on the run, you know, and that was the last time that I rode standing up on a horse. So those things were automatic, you know. But anyhow, then as we got into World War II, and I observed the Air National Guard flying out over our farm doing aerobatics. And I thought maybe that would be a better way of making a living than riding on a horse. So anyway, with World War II coming along, all of a sudden, my dad was visited by two men that were dressed very formally with white shirt and necktie. They swore into secrecy and told him that Uncle Sam needed a large acreage of land for a powder plant for artillery shells. They needed to manufacture powder, and that they needed to take over 91 farms south and east of Rosemount. A week and a half later, they announced publicly that we had 30 days to get our families off the farm, because, don't you know, there's a war on, and that we need this powder to combat the Japanese, the bad people, and then also the Germans that allied with the Japanese immediately. So I became vulnerable to being in the draft, and I decided I'd like to be a pilot, so why not enlist in the Army Air Corps, and went in as an aviation cadet. A year later, I was flying a 4-engine bomber, B-24. We had our combat crew training at Colorado Springs, and took a brand new B-24 over to Italy by way of South America, which was very entertaining. We crossed the equator and got over to Africa, and then up to Italy, and the Italians weren't doing too well, but the Germans were holding much of Italy at that time, if you recall, and it turned out that on the Adriatic side of Italy, we had moved up quite a ways past the spur of the boot, and so that's where we ended up. But when we got to Italy, the first thing they told us that the 459th Bomb Group didn't need a new aircraft, but they needed an aircrew real badly, and therefore we had to leave our new plane at the depot and arch the boot of Italy and proceed with going up to the 459th in Cerignola, Italy, about 30 miles south of the spur of the boot that sticks out into the Adriatic, and that was our home to fly missions throughout Southern Europe. It didn't take long to get our 5 missions in flying with other aircrew to get acquainted with the battle procedure and formation flying and so forth. And our targets were like Ploiești, Romania, which was the main source of oil and gasoline for Hitler's army. That's why Hitler moved through Czechoslovakia, Hungary, and Romania real quickly, because he needed that source of oil for Navy, Army, and his Air Force. Of course, they then had their best pilots in Germany assigned then to Ploiești, because that town was surrounded by 32 refineries for oil, and they had pipelines in this huge circle around the Ploiești that was all underground piping, so that if we knocked out 3 or 4 refineries on a bombing raid, there was still over 30 left to be destroyed. And they worked with free help, of course, with a lot of their so-called prisoners of war to repair all the damage and get it back in operation again. So it took over a year of bombing to finally put out of business the Ploiești. By that time, the Germans were making artificial means of fuel, so that no longer was feasible to repair anymore. It was so badly damaged. But that had the longest flak alleys at that time in the world, 17 minutes of flak. And of course, the hot time pilots of the German Air Force would intercept us and make head-on attacks on us as we were approaching the target. But as soon as the flag started to explode amongst us, the German, of course, the fighter pilots never liked to fly through flak, you know. So our escort would always stay off to the side, and the German fighter pilots would actually dive down, back down to their base, bleed off their airspeed, and land, refuel, and rearm. And then after that 17 minutes of flak, they would be back upstairs, ready to greet us again with attacks, sometimes from the tail, sometimes from the nose. We lost a lot of aircraft over Ploiești, Romania. Another not a fun target was Vienna, Austria. Vienna had 1,200 guns throughout the city, lined up for anti-aircraft duty. So as we approached the city in the clear blue sky, coming up along about 300 degrees, sort of west-northwest direction, always into a headwind, of course, so that would slow us down from our 130 kilometers, or knots rather, which is about 130 miles an hour. So it took a long time to get over the target with the headwinds. And as we got near the city, all of a sudden, the clear blue sky in front of us turned black, like it was a huge, big thunderstorm. And of course, we joke about it. We say that maybe we could lower our, if we flag a little bit higher, we could lower our landing gear and see if we could taxi on it. And we also wondered whether we could stay in formation because it looked like it was solid black. Fortunately, as we got into the barrage flag, just before we got into the barrage flag, the tracking flag, guided by radar, they knew our exact altitude, started to follow us through the barrage flag. We sort of figured that was double jeopardy and not really fair, but that's what we had to face. And on top of that, I remember at least 2.5 hours before we got to the target, Axis Sally came on our frequency. She told us where we were bombing. And would you believe, every time she came on, she told us the exact city that we were bombing that day, 2.5 hours before we got there. Rather discouraging news, but such is war, right? What do you do about it? Do you complain? No. That's part of war. So, anyway, the first time we visited Vienna, after we got in, but before we dropped our bombs, a plane about 150 yards ahead of us, 50 feet lower than us and 50 feet to our left. And with the exploding flak going on, you could see the white exposure, which would be able to see where all the formations were ahead of you. So that plane, about 150 yards ahead of us, unfortunately had a shell, anti-aircraft shell that exploded within the fuselage. With 6,000 pounds of bombs, with about 5,000 pounds of 100-octane fuel in our mid-tanks of our wing. And don't forget the oxygen at 1,200 pounds per square inch that fed our 9-man crew. That was a rather spectacular explosion. The largest piece of the aircraft or its crew was a piece of the right-hand rudder, about a foot square. The rest was all blown into much smaller pieces. We flew through the debris, and of course there was blood on our left wing. It was a pretty spectacular view of 9 people that suddenly disappeared from the vision. The second time we bombed Vienna, a plane about 250 yards ahead of us and also off to the left and a little lower than we were. The anti-aircraft shell exploded just to the left of the fuselage. So the plane didn't break up nearly as badly, but one of the aircrew with a back chute, parachute, was blown out of the aircraft, and he was obviously alive by his arm and leg motions, but unfortunately his face was away from the blast, so his back was all on fire. And we was hoping that he would try to get the fire out before he'd open his chute. But apparently the pilot chute popped right out as he was being blown off to the side of the right of the tip of the wing. And so the pilot chute popped out the main chute, but unfortunately the main chute was also on fire all around the rim, completely. Now, it's hard to believe that the fire would have burned that rapidly to cause it to be burning all around the circumference of the chute. But as we passed over him, our belly turret gunner and our tail turret gunner both reported, and after a few seconds, that the parachute had burned completely, and all it had left was the shrouds that were trailing him as he fell towards Mother Earth. And of course, you know, when you're falling feet first towards Earth, you accelerate at about 34 feet per second, and then you reach velocity, terminal velocity of about 120 miles an hour, as long as you're falling feet first. And it doesn't take long to figure out if you're flying at 21,000, which is about 4 miles upstairs, that in 2 minutes he would reach Mother Earth at 120 miles an hour. Normally you don't have the privilege of knowing when you're going to die, right? But this young man would know he had two minutes to live. How would you spend those 2 minutes? Would you curse the enemy? Would you think about your family back home? Would you pray? There's a lot of choices to make. That's war. And some of you, I'm sure, have seen death in many forms. And you recall them, right? Well, our turn came on our 15th mission to Budapest, Hungary. We had a #1 engine that the engine suddenly ran away, overspeeded. We tried to feather it. It got almost to the point where it would almost stop, but not quite. And it went back up again, overspeeding. And of course, you know, if it's overspeeding, the tips of the prop are actually supersonic at that speed. So after a little while, there's a wobbling of the nacelle holding the engine. And of course, if it wobbles a little bit too much to the right, the props sort of run together. And as they break off, they have a tendency, if they happen to go straight through the fuselage, they have the habit of sort of splitting your human body in half. So it's not a good time to stay in the aircraft. You really have a choice of getting out 4 miles upstairs or waiting a little longer, but how long do you want to wait? So the first pilot says, bail out. So we bail out, right? So it wasn't long before we reached Mother Earth. And that's when you drop out of the aircraft, when you have those 4 big propellers rolling up the air, unless you get yourself into a cannonball position, you flail the air, and I think I flipped over at least 3 times before I got out of the prop wash. But then you have that terrible quietness. There is no noise whatsoever. The plane has gone off, and it's so peaceful and so quiet, it's unbelievably quiet. And then you decide, well, first of all, okay, there we are, okay, sorry. We have to decide whether to open the chute or not, because I'm sure you have gone through the same experience, that you're told by your instructors that they had reports of German aircraft pilots using us as we parachuted down to Mother Earth, that they used us for target practice. So you might want to delay opening your chute for a while so that you won't be subject to being a target. So I intended to not open until I got down well below 10,000 feet, because it's nice to have plenty of oxygen. If you're up at 21,000 feet, you don't have much oxygen in the air or much anything in the air. It's pretty cold up there, So that was my plan, but as I was falling feet first, but I was starting to turn, pivoting, and then also turning in a circle. I was doing a double turn to the right, counter or clockwise. Yeah. So I didn't want to become disoriented. It's not a good idea to be falling towards Mother Earth and being disoriented. So I finally pulled my ripcord about 1,500 or so feet from the altitude that I bailed out on. And I had a good chute and everything was fine. But of course, it's one thing to jump out of a parachute and have the good chute and all of that. It's a new experience, right? But, what about when you land? How many of you speak Hungarian? I don't see any hands. And how many Hungarian farmers speak English? None. So, yeah, within 2 minutes after I landed and got my chute hidden in the weeds, was on farming. This was on a Sunday morning at about 10:30 o'clock in the morning. And they were Hungarian farmers armed with guns, shovels, rakes, pieces of like 2x4s, so forth, that come out to gather us up. And so I stopped walking because they were coming up from left and right and behind. So I stopped walking and put my hands up on top of my head to show that I was not armed. But nevertheless, I was shot. The bullet went through my right lung from the rear and bounced off a rib in the front of my body, and then ended up in the lower part of the heart and the right ventricle. Immediately my heart rate went up very high, almost to the point of fibrillation, where it no longer beats. It's a malfunction actually of the heart, with beating so fast that it can't push the blood through the body anymore. And my temperature went up immediately. It ended up at 104.7, and it stayed there for 5 days and 5 nights. So in the meantime, as I was standing and sort of getting wobbly, 2 farmers came up and held me by my elbows to keep me erect. And another farmer who was very short, probably about 5'2" to 3 inches tall, he had a long-handled shovel, actually a spade, with the pointy tip, this sand shovel. And he glared at me for a while and then walked around to my right. And I knew what was coming, but I wasn't able to do anything about it. He hit me in the back of the head with the base of that shovel. And you don't pass out immediately. I remember hearing the sound, and the best I can give it to you is that that sounded just like when Callahan used to hit his home runs out at the old real ballpark when it was in Bloomington. And as soon as you heard that noise of the ball being contacted with the bat, that was such a solid smack that you knew that ball was going out of the park. It was a home run ball. That's the sound of that impact that I still remember today. So you don't pass out immediately. You go from seeing clearly to then your sight fading to sort of gray, and then as it turns to black, you feel your knees sort of turn to butter, and you feel yourself falling towards the earth. I remember all of that so distinctly. It's only a fraction of a second, but it's very clear to me yet today. So I was unconscious for a long time. And one of the things they brought with them was a two-wheel cart with steel wheels, and they put the open parachutes on that. So they laid me in this cart, and apparently wheeled me over to a farm tank made out of concrete that was for watering the horses out in the field. And when I came to, I was leaned up against the concrete tank, and there was a Hungarian man that pulled up my shirt and underwear, and he reached down to the ground and got sandy soil and held it over my wound, the back of the right side that was bleeding, and he was trying to stem the blood flow with letting the sand come out of the heel of his hand. So one Hungarian farmer shoots me, and then others put me in a cart to wheel me because I'm not conscious. And then another farmer is trying to help me. But of course, you know, nobody recommends that you try to stop bleeding with using the soil, because soil has good bacteria and a lot of bad bacteria. But nevertheless, he was trying to stop the bleeding. Finally, the Hungarian Home Guard came with a flatbed truck, small truck, and loaded us all up. And they lifted me up and put me on top of all of the open chutes, parachutes. Of course, back then, you know, parachutes were made out of silk. So my blood ran through all of these parachutes and made it a job for somebody to get the blood out of the chutes before they could use them again. We ended up at a farming village. Well, first we stopped at a farming village that church had just left out, but they wanted a doctor to check me. And this Hungarian doctor, of course, spoke English, which was quite a benefit, you know, if you have somebody speak your language. That's a privilege. He asked, after he checked, he says, I know you have pain, because I was gasping for air, breathing through my mouth, and he had this rapid heartbeat, and then of course the temperature was up to 104.7. So he explained to me that you're not in very good shape. And they finally said, do you have any last wishes? Many countries in Europe, think we have it all wrong about pronunciation of V's and W's. Over in Europe, the W is the V sound and the V is the W sound. So for example, if you want wine, you say vino, right? So, do I have any last wishes? Was, do you have any last wishes? And I said, no, I need to get to a hospital. And he didn't respond to that. So we then went on and went to another farming village, which was the home for this home guard contingent. They had to put on scabbards on the rifles that they had because there was a bunch of farmers there waiting for us with, again, shovels, rakes, pieces of lumber, and rifles. But they held them off till they got us all into this headquarters that they have in their little farming villages. Farmers over in Europe, don't live on individual farms. Most all of them live in farming villages. So that it was obvious that I wasn't going to get to a hospital. This was as far as I got. And they had the local doctor there come, and I went through his repeat performance. Again, he spoke English, and he explained that I was a very sick man, and that he said, you're in a lot of pain, you really need to have an aspirin tablet. And he says that the German army came through a week before and took all my medications, all of my instruments I have, except for the one that you listen to, the heartbeat and so forth. They have that you put in your ears, your things in, and you listen to various parts of the chest to see what's wrong. So he again said that, do you have any last wishes? And I said, I happen to be a Catholic. I'd like to see a priest when it's available. He said, sure, they take care of that. And the priest came and gave me the last rites of the church. And there I was. But the doctor told the villagers, the military, that they had to try to break the temperature because it was so high, 104.7. So his instructions to the military was to pump cold water in a big wash tub, bring it in, and put a bed sheet in the water, soak it, and then bring it out, fold it up, and then wrap it around my chest to try to cool me down. And his orders was, do this every 15 minutes of every hour, 24/7. That went on for 5 days, and finally on the evening of the 5th day, my temperature had dropped down to 102.3. So the doctor immediately said that I really needed to get to a hospital. And I shook my head, yes, I agree. So the next morning, I was taken by a buggy over to a larger city where the railroad ran through, and railroad train came along, and they loaded me on the train. I had to be carried everywhere. I couldn't walk that well. Because the effort of trying to walk, my heartbeat went right back up again, and I was not doing too well. So after about an hour's ride to Budapest, Hungary, I was finally gotten into a hospital, military hospital number 11 on the west side of the Danube River. And there the doctor again spoke good English. And after 3 days, got me over to another building with the POWs that were there ahead of me, American POWs. There were, I think, 30-some at that time that were in the hospital with burns and broken arms and legs and so forth. But those, what?
The rest of your crew.
Pardon?
The rest of your crew that you were flying with.
The rest of our crew, we all got out except the nose gunner. We never could find out what happened to our nose gunner. Every time we'd ask, they said, "You don't answer our questions. Why should we answer your questions?" So, to this day, I still don't know what happened to our nose gunner. Why? Because the bombardier was supposed to be the one to help him get out from the nose turret, and we don't know what he did or didn't do. So that's still a question.
How eventually then did you get back home?
We got back home thanks to the Russians. They entered the city of Budapest. It took them about 3 weeks to go about 70 miles to Budapest. That they were that far away when you could hear the artillery shells being fired. In the evening, especially when things quieted down, it took that, starting then, the Russians bombed the city each night. Well, we had 2 of our POWs that couldn't be taken to the air raid shelter because they had badly broken legs. They were in leg cast that was to their hips, to their toes, and with the cord tied on over a pulley at the end of the bed, and with concrete pail filled, half filled with concrete to give the pull on it. So they had to stay in their bed. And I stayed with them for 52 bombings of Budapest. Because the guard that normally stayed on the 2nd floor that we were on in the hospital, he always disappeared. He never stayed up on the 2nd floor during bombing raids. He always disappeared. So I stayed with the 2 of them during the bombings, and I peek out through the curtain and see where the planes were, acted as let them know where the planes were, what direction they were going, and so forth.
Does anybody else have any questions that you want to ask him?
Questions? Well, going on from there.
Model
Yes.
of your B-24, what model was it, a B, a J?
A G.
Okay,
G, yes.
therefore it had a turret on the front.
Yep.
Were you in Buda or Pest?
We were in Buda, on the west side of the Danube.
Thank you.
Pest is nice and flat. Buda is very hilly, extremely hilly, yes. Yeah. Anyway, when the Russians entered the city, then the Germans took control, and we went from there. We went, of course, all aircrew had to be interrogated go to Frankfurt on the Main, to Oberrussel, which was the interrogation center for all aircrew personnel. And there the Germans started out speaking real good English because one of the German officers, both were captains. One of the German officers had spent 2 years in New York City just before World War II. So they were very nice and polite, but each day, as we didn't answer their questions, they became more angry. On the 5th day, they said, one of the interrogators said that I should come over to the window, and he pointed out an American POW, and the German guard with a rifle slung on the sling over his right shoulder, a step behind the American POW and one face to the right. We're walking into a path leading into a thick wooded area. So they pointed out that your lack of cooperation, you don't want to end up like your fellow POW. In other words, he was being taken out to the woods to be shot. I still refuse, being an Irish bull-headed man, I still refuse to talk. But in the afternoon, then the interrogators said, Mr. Carroll, or not Lieutenant Carroll, they always call me Lieutenant. We want to bring you up to date. Your father's name is William D. Carroll. Your mother's name is Mary Carroll. You were born on a farm near Rosemount, Minnesota. You entered the Army Air Force on the date that I did. Then they told me the date I graduated as a pilot and became a second lieutenant. Then they told me you should know that you ended up in the 459th Heavy Bomb Group at Cherry-Nova, and that you were a member of the 475th Squadron. And your squadron commander is now the group commander. He's been promoted from a lieutenant colonel to a colonel. He says your compatriots that are still flying are eating in a new stone mess hall. They said that you were eating in a little old tent back when you were flying. So they brought me all up to date on looking at a 3x5 card, roughly, written in German and pencil. So after all of this questioning, they have all this information already, and they were merely trying to verify what they had. But then, of course, they wanted to know about the equipment on their plane. Details like that, they wanted to get more information. And again, of course, being stubborn, I said that I only need to tell you my name, rank, and serial number. So off we went from there by train in the evening, about 30 miles to a temporary camp where they issued a little old cardboard suitcase, very small one, with some winter gear. Of course, remember we were in khakis because of July 2nd, the day I went down, was a beautiful warm day. And of course, in B-24, there was some heat in the pilot's compartment, so it wasn't as bad cold as you had in the air when you were flying even higher. It's cold. Yeah. So off we went from there. We left in late evening for Stalingrad 1, Baden, Germany, on the Baltic Sea, 100 miles north of Berlin. On the way towards Berlin that night at 9 o'clock, we reached Leipzig. And guess what? The British Air Force was bombing Leipzig, both sides of the railroad track. And the bombs were not like our 1,000 pounders, they were 2,000 pounders. And let me tell you, when you have holes exploding on both sides of the track, they pulled out precisely at 9 o'clock. You know, the Germans had this fetish about staying with their schedule. You'd think they'd wait until the bombing was done, but no, they went and the bombs were exploding on either side of the railroad. And our railroad car actually would sort of lift off on that side of the explosion. And my hearing went into a loud telephone ringing for 3 days before it finally subsided. So I understand what ringing of the ears is about. We all laid down on the floor of the train and covered the backs of our necks and heads so that we wouldn't get fatally cut by shards of the windows. You know, the regular trains, this wasn't a boxcar, this was a regular passenger train. It was compartment for 6 people. They put 12 of us in the room, each one of these compartments. But we stayed out on the wide aisle on the left side of the train and laid on the floor. And these shards of glass with every single window on either side of the train had blown in. Not completely, there was always some little piece of it that stayed in place, but each window actually imploded. And we got cuts, but nobody was seriously cut. So from there on, we went and we got to Berlin, and we stopped and stayed all day long on December 7th, 1944, at the main airport of Berlin. And of course, you know, the British had their daily, nightly flights of bombing of Berlin with the mosquito bombers, you know, that had a lighter bomb load, but they flew much faster than the other bombers. So they had a hard time catching up with them, shooting them down.
How did you eventually get back home?
Again, the Russians helped us. They overran Stalag Luft 1, and because Stalag Luft 1 was a officers' prison camp, which did have a lot of sergeants later on in the war when they left. Those that were in the hospital and had a record of hospitalization were sent by train up to Luft 1. So on the evening of April 30th, May 1, 45, the Russians overran our camp. And they kept going during the night. And the next morning there was the support groups that came along to occupy the territory. Most of them were busy drinking vodka, and they had a tendency every so often to take their submachine guns and fill the air with bullets in celebration of their victory. So it was sort of dangerous. The camp commander ordered us to stay within. The Russians wanted to tear down all the fences and have us free, and have us join in with them to have fun.
Did you
So
take a boat back home, or did you fly back home?
no, we were the only prison camp that was overrun by the Russians, that was permitted to be flown out by 8th AFHS. They came in, we had a military airport right next door to us. Incidentally, from Stalag Luft 1, 60 miles southeast of Stalag Luft 1 was P-20 when the V-2 rockets were sent up by the Germans over the Baltic Sea. And we watched that missile leaving its contrail, a big contrail, that would disappear. In other words, it was going up beyond atmosphere. So we knew that that would be capable of going to the United States, which was rather a stressful part of our.
Does anybody have any questions that they'd like to ask our speaker?
Any questions? Yes.
What happened to the bullet track? The bullet,
You have a question way over there.
same question.
Same question. When
The
it
bullet's
comes,
still in there.
it's still, as I speak today, that bullet moves up and down because it's in the lower part of the heart. And of course, when the beat of the heart pushes the blood from the heart out through the aorta and so forth, out to the body, it compresses the lower part of the heart, moves upward about 1.5 inches, pushing the blood out of the right ventricle. So every beat of the heart, the bullet moves up and down about 1.5 inches.
There was another question over here.
It's the same question.
No, it doesn't hurt because that bullet was seemingly red hot. It's the best example of patience that I can think of because I was on fire and I couldn't do a thing about it. So the muscle of the heart around the bullet was all burnt. So it's still hanging there with the tougher lining of the bands of muscle. So, but there's a little hole in my heart that is
Finally, we're going to ask you, you got back to the farm and had a family?
well, yeah. You have to understand that when I found out that the bullet was in my heart, I thought that I think all of us that were in combat figured that we were all of us go back home and it would just be an experience for us. We didn't really think that we'd become prisoners of war or be killed, right? We're hopeful.
Did the war change you?
Yes, the war changed me very much because after finding out that I have a bullet in my heart, I knew I couldn't go back and do the work that you have to do on a dairy farm. And I also knew that Uncle Sam would tell me that I'm not fit to be a pilot because if I were flying with a bullet lodged in my heart, the passengers would want to bail out even if they didn't have a parachute. So there you are as a prisoner of war, having no rights nor nothing. And you know that you're not capable of going back home and doing things that you're able to do at that point. It's
You're
a,
a remarkable man with a remarkable story. Let's salute him with a good hand.
Let's just go home.